All right, welcome everyone, and welcome to my continued series on European history from the Enlightenment to the end of World War I. This is essentially the third part of this series, and a couple people have asked me in the past, well, why do you do a lecture on the causes of and a lecture on the French Revolution? Why don't you just put them together? And certainly I could do that, but I always felt that in the case of this revolution, there was so much backstory, I think, that needed to be looked at in order to set us up for understanding what on earth happened in 1789. Because once the revolution occurs, the story of the revolution itself is very complex, very bloody, very confusing, and I just thought it was really well worth it to spend the time giving you a really good background on why the French people rose up to eventually overthrow the monarchy. Now, of course, I always see the French Revolution in sort of one of the big three of the last 300 years. I would refer, of course, to the American Revolution, which preceded this revolution by 13 years. 1776 was that revolution, and the French was 1789. Both those revolutions were revolutions of the Enlightenment. And what I mean by that is that the ones that were sort of at the forefront of both those revolutions were very much inspired by the thinkers of the French philosophers, and of course the English contributors like John Locke, Sir Isaac Newton, and others. So in that way, these two revolutions are connected. And in reality, French support for the American revolutionaries, in addition to French involvement in the 7 Years' War, which preceded the revolution by about 10 or 15 years, the American Revolution that is really what bankrupted the French economy that would lead to their own revolution. So lots of really interesting tidbits and bits of information to look at when we link those two revolutions together. I will be doing a talk, and I do have a talk on the American Revolution and the impact it has on the evolution of Canada as well, but we'll look at that another time as well. Revolutions are complex because, you know, when revolutionaries are vying for power, they are usually able to mobilize people behind their cause with grand ideas of all the great things they want to achieve once they obtain power. And I always say that it's always very, very easy to make claims about what you would like to do when you take power, but it's an entirely different thing to actually come through on any of your promises. Particularly in a revolution where there's so much chaos, so many unknowns, so many small groups of bandits behaving contrary to the revolutionaries, and then civil wars and so on and so forth. So revolutions are complicated because when you eliminate the existing government, you are starting from scratch. You are basically leaving behind the old system and creating something new. It's more than just taking over a bad or bankrupt regime. It's about establishing a new currency. It's about establishing a new government, maybe new levels, whether they be provincial, federal, municipal, the judiciary, the economy, employment, the education system, the medical system, the defense, the army, the navy, so on and so on and so forth. There are so many variables, but it's fair to say that when revolutions are about to happen, those kind of things are not necessarily on the radar of the revolutionaries. At that immediate moment, it's about overthrowing the existing order. And you know, revolutions, as Mao Zedong once said, is not a dinner party. And I would definitely agree that once you make that first move, once you fire that first shot, you can never take it back. And at the storming of the Bastille in July of 1789, that is really sort of the trigger point of this revolution, which is where we're going to end today. But so what I want to do is I want to go back a couple hundred years before this and just sort of set us up for the circumstances that brought us to 1789. So, 1 year before, in 1788, this is 1 year before the Revolution, of course, France was a leader in military power, wealth, science, culture, and other countries emulated their architecture and cuisine. In addition, French was the language of European diplomacy. France was like the epicenter of so many, even of intellectual thought, certainly during the Enlightenment. Peter the Great marveled at the Palace of Versailles and emulated that with his Winter Palace, which would be built in St. Petersburg. So France was kind of like the nation that all other European powers kind of looked to as a source of inspiration for a variety of reasons. And in addition to that, the international language of diplomacy in Europe at the time was French. So a shift in the political, social, and economic climate with a growing voice from the bourgeoisie, talk about who they are, is essential in understanding the revolution. Okay. Unlike the revolution of 1917, the Russian Revolution, which was largely, while it was instigated by intellectuals, it claimed to be in the interest of the workers and the peasants. This revolution was more sort of pushed, guided by, and reinforced the values of the emergent bourgeoisie. And that term has been used in so many different contexts, but for our purposes, we're looking at sort of the middle classes, the self-made, hard-working people who earn a good living or have a strong business. Basically, the segment of society that is independent, that is relatively wealthy and is ambitious, and nobody likes to have government step on your toes. And of course, the bourgeoisie, in this case, of course, would be a real driving force behind this revolution in 1789. Enlightened thinkers in the salons were instrumental in pushing for change while the government floundered. If you've watched my lecture on the Enlightenment, I go into great detail about this, so I'll spare those details now. It's actually an understatement to say that the government was floundering. In 1788, Louis XVI was just entirely and completely inept to dealing with what was going on. He was a relatively shy human being, introverted, didn't really necessarily want to lead. In many ways, I see a lot of similarities between Louis XVI and Tsar Nicholas II. And not only because those are the two leaders who were overthrown by their respective revolutions, one in Russia and one in France, but they had this sort of similar, ineptitude might be the wrong word, this lack of desire to rule with authority, not really capable of fully understanding what was happening, passing duties on to people who may be not entirely qualified to do the job, and so on and so forth. So I think in many ways, both Louis XVI and Tsar Nicholas II are kind of tragic characters, and we'll come back and talk about Louis XVI in greater detail. 1788, bankruptcy due to French involvement in the 7 Years' War. For my American friends, this would be referred to, I think, what you call the French Indian Wars of 1755 to 1763. In Canada and in Britain, I think we refer to it as the 7 Years' War. These were colonial wars in North America between the British and French. And right smack in the middle of these colonial wars in 1759 would be the key event when Great Britain would take over control of the colony of Quebec. And that, of course, would have a tremendous impact on the shaping of Canada. And we'll look at that another time, too. Another loaded topic we don't want to abridge at this moment. But for our purposes right now, the bankruptcy of the French monarchy was a result of the involvement in the 7 years, but also the American Revolutionary Wars from 1755 to 1783, I believe they were, coupled with harvest failures. That's always a sure bet for discontent, which were due to drought. Both of these things, harvest failures, drought, and financial chaos, is what leads to problems that are proved to be insurmountable. All right, so now we're going to flip back a bit in time. So 1610, when Henry IV or Henry of Navarre. What a fascinating character he is. Another time when we look at the European religious wars, the Reformation and the religious wars that follow, I'll once again explain quite a bit about him. So keep your eyes open down the road. I will be doing a lecture on the Renaissance, on the Reformation, and also the religious wars that followed. Fascinating. One of my favorite periods as well. But Henry Navarre was assassinated. He was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, Louis, whose mother, Mary de' Medici, acted as regent. And so many stories about these monarchs that become, monarchs when they're very, very young. I mean, we saw this with Louis XIV, the Sun King. I think he became emperor when he was 5. I'd have to look again, but obviously when a child of that age becomes a monarch, you need people around you to guide you, and usually it's a parent or it's appointed official to serve as like a regent, someone who oversees their education, guides them hopefully in the right direction. And of course regents can be incredibly influential because they're the ones that are navigating the young person's values and political beliefs and point of view and all those kind of things. So you really want to make sure that the regent is serving in the best interest of the country when they're raising the future monarch. Cardinal Richelieu, what a remarkable character he was, would become a close advisor and friend to Medici, which saw power centralized with Richelieu's statesmanship. Richelieu is an interesting guy because he expanded well beyond the role of a Christian or Catholic figure in the affairs of the state. He actually got directly involved in the managing of the state and making recommendations. So in many ways, Richelieu was a big part of raising of the young Louis. Conflicting interests among the upper classes resulted in a more absolutist type of leadership in France. Okay. So when you have a nobility or an aristocracy that are tooting by their own horns or are predominantly working out of self-interest, or they're not really working in synchronicity with each other, then the monarchy, the king, i.e. or the queen, will feel that there is a need to keep a lid on discontent, to keep a lid on the discord by building a state that allows for the monarch to make very firm and strong decisions that really nobody can say no to. I mean, it's the simplest way, to identify absolutism. The monarch has absolute power to make decisions as he or she sees fit. Now, in saying that, the monarch should be well versed in the economy and politics and interpersonal skills. Hopefully would and should have a good relationship with the nobility classes and so on and so forth. But that doesn't always happen. And I think at this point in history, things were in transition. And so what we see is a development of a more centralized French leadership at the time. Until his death in 1642, Cardinal Richelieu weakened the power of the nobility, strengthened mercantilism, eliminated Protestant influence of the Huguenots, or Huguenots, some have said. French Protestants, I believe they were more Calvinist than they were Lutheran. And when we get to the Reformation, I will explain all the different strains, if you will, of the Reformation, whether it be Anabaptists or Anglicanism and Lutheranism and Calvinism. And there's a whole bunch of branches, and it does get a bit murky, but it is explainable. Anyway, he eliminated the influence of the Huguenots and installed administrative officers loyal to the crown. Makes sense? Across France, previously controlled by nobles in local jurisdictions. So what we see is in all these sort of provincial areas of France that were controlled by local nobilities, now what Richelieu has managed to do is to centralize that even though these individual nobility groups within the provinces of France can exist, there's a certain expectation that when push comes to shove, they're going to do what they're told by the monarch. And if you're a smart noble and you want to keep your position of wealth and your fancy home and your privileged life, you're going to do, you know, what you can to maintain that position. You're not going to sacrifice that, but that's what we see happening, and that was really Cardinal Richelieu that really centralized the French government towards a greater degree of absolutism than had existed before. All right, here he is. Well, you know, of all the monarchs, I mean, this one, Louis XIV, is probably one of the most famous and infamous as well. Because he was such a talented, gifted individual, as well as being a monarch. I mean, and he had a great, charming personality. You know, the ballet came out during his administration. He was obsessed with table manners and just manners in general. That through his example, in his lead, he really created a very, rigid might be a bit strong, but a very strong system amongst the nobility classes of just manners, table manners, etiquette, dancing, all these things, how to bow, how to do all these things. It became very, very refined. That's not to say these things didn't exist before Louis, but they become very much refined under his leadership. He would inherit a tightly controlled absolutist government, which he would maintain as the Sun King. And as I said, I believe he was 5 years old when he became monarch. With tight controls, the French economy did not develop the private enterprise characteristic, that fueled the English economy. Okay, you didn't have that spirit of capitalism in the same way that you did in Great Britain, where we had already seen a transition away from absolutism. Of course, they fought their revolutions, their glorious revolution, and they dealt with Cromwell, they dealt with the Anglican Protestant, the Presbyterian upheavals, and all those things, and it kind of come out to a more constitutional form of government. So they were very much at the forefront of that. But the French never really developed that culture in the same way. Conditions worsened when Louis suppressed the Huguenots, or Huguenots, who had a key role in commerce, industry, and the professions, and they left for Holland or England. This, to me, was a profound error. Now, the problem with Louis is he wanted to be the Sun King. Which I believe it was self-dubbed. I believe he dubbed himself the Sun King, which means the center of the universe. We can only have one king, we can only have one language, one nation, and one religion. This is important. There was no way that Louis was going to allow there to be a split in the religious realm, if you will, as there was in Germany or the German states at this time, between Lutheran sects, if you will, or Protestant sects, if you will, and the Catholic faith. So all of this was about consolidating France under one rule, one king, one religion. The Huguenots had received some, Henry of Navarre was a Huguenot. He was raised that way by his mother, but then when he became the King of France, he had to leave that faith and say, look, I declare myself now a Catholic. I believe he said that Paris is worth a mass, although we don't actually know if Henry Navarre actually said that. But nonetheless, that process begins with Navarre, but it really becomes consolidated. The problem was that many of the Huguenots had a very strong independent streak. They were very much professional people, particularly those in industry and commerce. So in many ways, by consolidating his absolute monarchy, he had frightened away some very, very capable and talented people that were contributing to the economy, who then would go to Holland and England, and lived perfectly happy, successful lives there. So, involvement in wars of Spanish succession was a severe economic blow to Louis, and upon his death in 1715, his 5-year-old great-grandchild would become king with his uncle as regent. Okay, so maybe it wasn't Louis XIV, that maybe I guess it must have been his great-grandchild that became a king at 5. I'd have to look. For some reason I thought Louis became king at 5 years old too, but I'll check my notes on that one too. So now you got another situation where you got a young fellow who becomes king, and in this case his uncle becomes his regent, his overseer, to guide him through. It can't be understated how incredibly loved and revered, by the way, Louis XIV was. I mean, people, when he would have his dinner parties, people were just chomping at the bit to sit next to him. Everybody wanted to sit next to Louis. Everybody wanted to impress him and be the most refined, the most well-dressed. And he was somebody that people aspired to please. And that's a pretty good place to be for a monarch. There was one incident, just to give you an example of how incredibly powerful, and not even necessarily through fear. That's the other thing I like about Louis. People they genuinely adored him in many ways. I mean, sure, they feared him because he could do things that that might be unpleasant, or at least give orders to do things that are unpleasant. But for the most part, people were enamored with him. And there was one time when he was having a big dinner of some kind. The ceremony, I can't recall at the time, but you know, the meals that they would prepare, the amount of cooks they would require, and people, you know, preparing the meats and the vegetables and the wine and da-da-da-da-da. Anyway, Louis had been served his dinner with some meat dish. I can't remember if it was duck or whatever it was, but it was slightly undercooked, and he kindly sent it back and said, look, he asked the cook to just heat this up a bit more. It's a little bit underdone. And I guess when the cook found out, had been told that he had served slightly uncooked meat to the monarch, he committed suicide right there on the spot. So, you know, just I don't know, once again, probably more so out of a tremendous sense of sadness that he'd done this, as opposed to fear. All right. So anyway, remarkable character. We'll have to come back and look at him in more detail. All right. Well, reigned from, now this would be, let me check again. It was his 5-year-old great-grandchild. Yeah, great-grandchild. Reigned from 1715 to 1774, and had neither the will or the talent of his predecessor. Oh my, has this ever happened before in history? You get a really strong monarch, rules with authority, creates a tremendous amount of support underneath his leadership, and then that leader goes. And if the follow-up isn't as strong as his or her predecessor, these are very, very difficult shoes to fill in. Now, in saying that, you know, anybody was going to struggle to compete with the legacy of Louis XIV, but his great-grandson was not interested. You know, I mean, you got to consider too, when you're going to be the next monarch, you're not necessarily going to want the job. I mean, look at, you know, Tsar Nicholas of Russia in 1894, for example, said in his diary, you know, on the day that he became monarch, he said, "This is a day I've been regretting all my life." You know, poor guy didn't want to be monarch. And I think in many ways Louis XV didn't want the job either, but hey, you've got to roll with it now. His weakness was magnified by the growth of salon culture in Paris and the ideas of the Enlightenment. So he had the misfortune of being monarch at a time where all these incredible dynamic ideas are swirling around and being discussed in the salons of France. Crippling losses in the 7 Years' War, there are the dates, yeah, 1756 it is, rather, to 1763, and the American Wars of Independence, 1775 to 1783, and poor financial administration sent the economy in the tank. The French had spent so much money fighting these two conflicts that they had bankrupted their own economy. you know, one of the ironies, of course, when we look at the American Revolution, that here's an absolutist France supporting, you know, revolutionaries who want to build a constitution. I mean, what's the deal with that? Why would an absolutist France pump all this time, money, and energy into supporting revolutionaries? Well, the only reason is that they were fighting their number one enemy, the British. But the irony, once again, being that it was the French support for the American Revolution that bankrupted their economy and led to their own revolution 13 years later. So it's a kind of an interesting set of circumstances, to say the least. The transfer of power from the nobility under Richelieu to intendants, okay, these people that are directly responsible to the crown, and parliaments who registered the king's demands, saw the economy stagnate. Okay, so I mean, even if this process didn't occur with the intendants and the parliaments, the economy was in the tank as it was. You know, and there were no predictors in these days that, oh, you're spending too much money. You know, and you think, well, how does that work? How do monarchies spend too much money? Well, you know what? At the end of the day, if your leadership is overspending or spending more than taxes or revenues being brought in, you're going to have a problem. And that's exactly what was happening to France at the time. Magistrates of parliaments were nobles who bought their offices. Okay, money, money, money. So they worked out of self-interest, right? So that's a big problem, right? Their class, their nobility, and the clergy. Everybody was so concerned about maintaining their position in French society, and the French aristocracy and the French government was set up in such a way with the intendants and the parliaments that's what it drove people to do. Nobody wanted to sacrifice their own lives and their own money. Everybody was looking out for number one. And you can't have a government with bureaucrats or people working within the system who are working primarily out of self-interest. They should be agents working for the people, so to speak. And I guess that's where democracy comes in, and essentially that's where revolution in this case comes in. So let's look at the conditions of France leading up to it. Now, as I mentioned in my last lecture, we use the term ancien regime in French, or the old regime. Very generally, when you look at the sweep of European history, the term old regime generally refers to life in Europe before the French Revolution. So here we go. From between 1715 to 1789, France's population grew from 18 to 26 million. And as an agrarian nation with an undeveloped industrial base, this surge in population put great strain on the peasant class, right? And here we go. And if you watch my last lecture, we spent quite a bit of time talking about peasant life. And we know from that you know, their conditions were miserable, horrible. And so much of their quality of life was determined by the seasons. You know, if it rained enough, if the soil was healthy, if things were growing. Of course, if there's droughts or if there's famine, I mean, all these things can have a dramatic impact on the peasants because they're so dependent on the earth and the ability to grow things, to live. Harvest failures, well, there you go. And bread shortages saw prices skyrocket and put great stress on the peasants, who filtered into the cities looking for work. And this is the thing. When people begin to struggle in the agricultural sector, and these kind of conditions happened all over Europe as well, not just France, but people are going to filter into the city. And it's not like there's jobs available. I mean, people would go to the city and they would be forced to live as vagrants. They would be forced to beg. They would be forced to sleep in, you know, in ditches or wherever it might be. And of course, as a result of these terrible conditions, people resort to crime. So there's a lot of issues with overcrowding, with criminal activity, with, you know, theft and all these kind of things. So unemployment, poverty, vagrancy, and crime grew rapidly in Paris, where unemployment could reach as high as 50%. So Paris was like a cauldron of of discontent, you know. And at the end of the day, you know, when we look at 1789 and we look at 1917, you know, what really triggers revolution? Not necessarily ideas. They're always there, whether it be Marxism in Russia or the writings of Rousseau before the French Revolution. At the end of the day, what triggers revolution are hungry stomachs. And, you know, bread riots are when people are protesting either the price of bread or the lack of availability of bread. And that's what really drives people to violence, is when they're hungry. You know, not when they're enamored with the writings of Voltaire. I'm not negating that, but what I'm saying is that those were ideas of the upper class and middle classes, people that could read and afford the books. But the people on the ground, the peasants, the ones that are really struggling, they're driven by hunger more than ideas to change whatever it is that's bringing them down. Since the French economy was built around aristocratic privilege, the lower classes began to get angry. Now, once again, the French Revolution is not a peasant revolution by any means. In fact, Karl Marx himself said the French Revolution simply did not go far enough. It was heading in the right direction, but it did not go far enough to please the poor. I mean, a lot of that has to do with the fact that they were, you know, they were illiterate, they don't fully understand the circumstances they find themselves in. They're angry because they're hungry, but, you know, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out that when you've got nothing available and you're looking for someone to blame, well, you're going to blame your leadership. And, you know, there is a bubbling cauldron, but there's no real strong centralized leadership amongst the peasant classes at this time. I mean, they're basically just, you know, wallowing about in anger and fury and not really knowing how to achieve satisfaction in how they're feeling. I mean, yeah, they want more bread at the end of the day. That's what they want. But now more and more peasants are beginning to understand that it's more than just a lack of unavailability of bread, that there's something happening in the economy, something happening above them that is contributing to this. So it doesn't take a degree in political science for people to figure out that the way the economy is being managed is impacting their lives. So, all right. Well, so how do you solve these problems? Well, French society was broken up into 3 groups or estates. Now these are very general, and I'm not saying they're exclusive to these groups, and I'm going to explain in more detail soon. You have the clergy, you have the nobility, and then you have everyone else in this body, the estates general. The first estate was the clergy, which included about 100,000 people at 0.5%. So that's like what, you know, 0.5% of the population, who owned 10% of land and collected taxes on this property. In addition, they collected 10% of everyone's income, known as a tithe. Okay, so this would be a tax. Everyone had to pay. You had to pay to the clergy. Everyone's got to pay their 10%. Now, I'm not sure if that was limited to the land owned by the clergy or by the church. Probably was, but either way, you know, now you've got to pay all this money. And, you know, the people that are being taxed at this time are people that don't have the money anyway. So the second estate, about 390,000 people, or 1.5% of the population. So you put those numbers together, the first 2 estates of 3 encompass 2% of France's population. Either way, 1.5 of the population were nobles, who were the most privileged citizens after royalty. So estate 1, the clergy; estate 2, the nobles. And then estate 3, third estate, included the other 98%. Everybody else, you're all in there, including the bourgeoisie, the emerging middle classes, the urban workers, skilled trades people, and peasants. So you had quite a number of self-made, hard-working, relatively educated, literate individuals within the third estate. Now, I think the peasants probably wouldn't have even known they were part of this estate. I mean, they wouldn't have even understood that there was any body that represented them in any way, shape, or form. So, all right, so leading to 1789. So inequities of taxation would lead to revolution in 1789, right? But expensive wars, harvest failures, famine, and bankruptcy would play a big role as well, of course. So all these things were kind of converging. I mean, you know, the writing was on the wall, a combination of inept leadership, of poor economic planning, of overspending, harvest failures. I mean, it's just one problem after another. Finance Minister Turgot under Louis XVI, he was the last one before the Revolution. He was the one married to Marie Antoinette. We'll talk about her in greater detail next week as well, or next time, sorry. Attempted reform but was sidelined by the church and nobility who blamed him for the bread riots of 1775. Now Turgot, in his defense, was the finance minister, and he didn't create these problems, by no means. These were problems that have been evolving for decades. But because he was the one seen as the one that should be fixing it, the assumption was that he wasn't doing his job. And understandably, right? Even though it was misguided. He was replaced by Necker, okay, who borrowed money to pay for French involvement in the American Revolution, and by war's end in 1783, this is the end of the American Revolutionary Wars, interest payments for these loans equaled 50% of yearly revenues. Interest payments alone. So where the heck are you going to get the money, right? You can't keep taxing the peasants. There's only so much you can take from them. They're already paying all kinds of dues. They're paying a tithe to the church. It goes on and on and on. They don't have capital. They live off the land. They eat the food they grow, and they sell their surplus, or they have to give it up to the church or whoever in the local nobility of who may own the land that they work on. Subsequent ministers insisted on income taxation of the nobility, but those were promptly shut down. Okay, the only realistic means of bringing in tax revenues would be by taxing people who had the money. Okay, the problem was the nobility refused. Well, you got to find somewhere else to get it, man. We're not paying any taxes. You kidding? We never have. We never will. Well, they were the only ones that had the money to pay it. So they daddled, sat on their hands and complained, and 1789 was just around the corner. So the wealthy refused to bear the burden, and France was in a major financial crisis. In a last-ditch attempt to fix the crisis, the king called in the Estates General, which had not convened since 1614. So wait a second here, 1614? And you call in the Estates General, I don't have a year the first time, but let's call it early 1789. I'd have to look again. So what that means is that the Estates General, that three-body system, remember the 0.5 clergy, 1.5 nobility, 98% everyone else, hadn't been called in 170 years. Which means that there was no one alive to remember the last time the Estates General was called in. So you call this thing together, and people are coming together for the first time. They're probably looking back at 1614 and saying, well, however it was organized and run back in 1614 is the way we're going to do it now. And that was the expectation, that that's how this was going to work. So King Louis would grant the demand of the nobility, who thought each estate would vote as a block, as it had done in 1614. There you go. So we assume that's the way it's going to be. Necker would return as comptroller to help avoid bankruptcy, and he had support from the bourgeoisie. The composition of the Third Estate saw prominence of lawyers and intellectuals who were fueled by the Enlightenment. Okay, so this is the interesting thing, is that the key literate figures in the Third Estate were those people who had been reading Rousseau, Voltaire. They'd been inspired by all these ideas that talked about whether it be constitutionalism or human right, well, maybe not human rights, but individual rights, individual liberty, those kind of things. Louis would request a list of grievances from the three estates, the Cahiers, and each estate would meet separately to validate the credentials of their representatives. A list of grievances from the three estates, right? Okay. Well, I would imagine that the grievances would be far more significant in the Third Estate, considering they comprised 98% of the population. So they call this thing together, the leadership of the three estates come, and we'll see what happens next. So the third estate was focused on creating a new assembly of the three estates that would vote by head. Okay, that's the other thing. So you mean to tell me that everybody gets one vote in the three estates? Does that mean the 98% get one equal vote to the 1.5 and the 0.5%? That's exactly what it means. So some liberal clergy and nobles supported the idea, and by June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly. Okay, the National Assembly is the third estate going rogue, because they're saying this is ridiculous that we, the 98%, only get 1 out of 3 votes. That means if we have a vote by estate, the clergy and the nobility could outvote us 2-3, or 2-1 rather, and then we are left holding the bag, so to speak. So the fairness of this was pretty clear that, well, that it wasn't fair. The new National Assembly would be locked out of the place where they were meeting, because they couldn't meet as a separate entity in the Estates General where they would meet there. They had to meet somewhere else. They get locked out of the space they were going to, and the leaders would meet in a tennis court and sign an oath not to disband until they wrote a new constitution for France. Okay, it says tennis court, and a lot of history books say tennis court, but I believe, I'll have to check my sources again, that it was a handball court. So either way, it was a sports court of some kind. As news broke of the discord, angry mobs roamed the countryside, and the king brought 20,000 German and Swiss mercenaries to Paris and fired Neckar, the finance minister. This action encouraged further violence. So what the king does is he throws gasoline on the fire. He himself should have recognized, hindsight's 20/20 of course, but he should have recognized that the 98% had a legitimate cause for discontent of being limited to one vote against the other 2 estates. And instead of trying to meet compassionately with the third estate, and I know that might seem naive because at the time they were not behaving themselves, and the king didn't take kindly to that, but maybe there should have been more efforts to try to conciliate or be more conciliatory with them and try to find some kind of rational system, because there was already so many variables in France that were creating problems. The last thing he needed was an angry 98%, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. So either way, he brings in the troops. He's just making things worse. And it leads to the event, which I believe, and most historians would agree, it is the trigger point of the revolution. Just like the storming of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg in November 1917. Same kind of thing. The French and the Russian revolutions roll out. There's so many similarities in the backstory of those revolutions and the rollout of these revolutions as well. It makes for a very interesting study when you compare and contrast those 2 revolutions. July 14th, 1789, Paris erupted after a crowd obtained 30,000 muskets from a fortress, moving then toward the Bastille, an old fortress prison seen as a symbol of the king's absolute authority. So the crowd or mob was heading to the Bastille specifically because that to them was a symbol of the repression of the monarchy. We're going to go there, we're going to confront this entity, this beast in Paris. The crowd demanded the release of all prisoners, and the governor capitulated, that is the governor of the prison, the Bastille, after the attack, where the mob would find only 7 prisoners and no large storehouses of weapons. So I think they were hoping for, we're going to storm the Bastille, the gates are going to open, thousands of people are going to run out and join the revolution. But there are only 7 of them. So Marquis de Lafayette was given leadership of the Paris militia, but he would eventually favor the National Assembly. Okay, so he's looking at the circumstances and probably thinking, okay, now I want to be on the right side of history here. You know, the National Assembly is 98%, and I think he probably had sympathies for many of the things that they were upset about. He created the tricolor flag, okay, Marquis de Lafayette, he created that, right? The white for the royal family, the red and blue of the militia. So you've got this sort of compromise, you know, you got the royalty in there. Now remember, nobody's talking yet about getting rid of the monarch yet. That comes a little later. In the next 10 years, though, France would undergo dramatic changes. So in 1789, when the revolution happens, it is just the beginning of an enormous amount of disruptive change and chaos and lack of leadership and too much leadership. And then, of course, there's the terror and the murder and the guillotine. And it gets very, very, very confusing and very bloody. And I think a lot of people towards the end of the 1790s were feeling a desperate need for normalcy, for strong leadership, and for order, if you will. And there was a real lack of that in that 10 years. So the next lecture for us is going to be looking at the events pretty much from 1789 to 1797, 98, roughly when Bonaparte comes into the picture. And that, of course, we're going to have to look at extensively as well. So anyway, thank you very much for coming, and the next lecture for this series will be the French Revolution itself. All right, thank you.